Friends, colleagues, dear brothers and sisters, let me start with a confession. I'm extremely nervous these days when I speak, particularly in the United States. And the reason for that is the story I'm about to tell you. Often when I've spoken at meetings, I will say how close we are to midnight in terms of the climate clock that is ticking so fast and the fact that we are running out of time. So I start by saying, for example, just this week, a few days ago, climate scientists have told us that the Antarctic ice melt is happening much faster than was anticipated. And sea level rise is much more closer to us than, in fact, we imagine. I have the honor of serving on the board of 350.org, which is one of the main climate organizations. I hope some of you are active in 350. That's good. It's called 350.org because the safe concentration of carbon in the atmosphere is 350 parts per million. A few years ago, we overshot that, and we are now about 420 parts per million. The last time the planet was more than 400 parts per million, we had a situation where the Arctic was completely ice-free, sea level was about 15 to 20 meters higher than it is now, and Africa was covered in savanna forests. I've got to say, Africa being covered in savanna forests is quite a cool idea, but the bottom line is we are running out of time. And once I was speaking at an audience and I was like giving all these dire statistics, and a woman put up her hand and said, "Mr. Naidoo, have you heard of Martin Luther King?" And I said, "Yes, of course. He inspired me as a young activist in the anti-apartheid struggle." And she said, "Do you know what his most famous speech was called?" And I very tentatively said, thinking it was a trick question, "I Have a Dream?" And she said, "Yes! It was I Have a Dream, but when I hear you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare." How are you going to inspire people to take the actions that they need to as fast as they need to, and how do you keep people enthused? So one of the challenges of leadership at the moment is how do we speak truth to power? How do we tell it as it is? But at the same time, how do we do it in a way that doesn't immobilize people and actually encourages people to actually stand up, take a stand, and get involved? So I want to go back to Martin Luther King now for some inspiration, which I think is a challenge that each and every one of us, including those of us in the environmental movement, need to take seriously. So the question to each and every one of us in this moment of crisis is whether we in fact have also adjusted far too well to abnormality, adjusted far too well to inequality. Because the last point that he makes, and I want to repeat it, I refuse to be well adjusted to the idea that we would take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. Of course, he was talking about the United States, but that applies globally. And the link between that inequality that comes from meaningless consumption to a large extent is one of the big drivers of climate change. Our friends in WWF, for example, say that if we were to deliver the lifestyles that people in developed countries and the elites in developing countries take for granted, we would need between 5 and 8 planets. And we often say that we have no plan B but to address climate change and engage in a revolution, energy revolution, and get off fossil fuels as fast as possible because we do not have planet B. I know there's some crazies in your country that are thinking that we can get to Mars and we can move a lot of people there, but I believe that that is not actually a feasible proposition. So within this context of the climate clock ticking, the fact that we are running out of time, we need to recognize that in fact our political and business leaders are suffering from a terrible case of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance, those of you who do psychology will know, when all the facts are before you, cognitively you should be able to actually understand that something needs to be done, but it's far too painful or complicated, and then even though the facts tell you you have to do something in one direction, you still continue to do things in a different direction. So in July last year, I had the privilege of being in Kiribati, which is a small Pacific Island state. And I visited various Pacific Island nations while I was there, Vanuatu, Fiji, Australia, and New Zealand as well. And the slogan that the people in Vanuatu, Kiribati, they say it Kiribati actually, and Fiji was chanting was 1.5 to stay alive. Now, some of you might not be that familiar with 1.5 versus 2 degrees, but there's a big debate about how much of warming our planet can actually take since the start of the industrial period when we started burning oil, coal, and gas. And small island states, least developed countries, countries like Bangladesh, which have a coastal catastrophe already, where sea level rise is already pushing people inward, are saying if we go more than 1.5, we might not survive. In fact, by the time we got to the Paris climate negotiations last year, the slogan it became, not 1.5 to stay alive, but 1.5 we might survive. Now, one of the uncomfortable things we have in the world is the fact that we are dealing not only with climate injustice, meaning that the people that are paying the first and most brutal price for climate impacts are those that lead the most low carbon lifestyle. So we are losing hundreds of thousands of people directly from climate impacts now, and most of the time there are people who have very limited culpability for carbon emissions. So within this context, we have to ask ourselves, where did the Paris Agreement get us to? And the Paris Agreement was much better than many people thought it would be, but it was much worse than what the world actually needs. You should not see the agreement made in December as a climate solution. You have to see it simply that it gave us all, as humanity, the chance to live to fight another day. If you were to come to the conclusion, well, Paris delivered a solution as our governments have actually tried to suggest to us, then you will be allowing yourself to be misled. So within this context of time running out, the climate movement must ask itself a crucial question. How can we accelerate change and progress towards reducing carbon emissions, and how do we do that in the shortest space of time? Because if you want to put it as they used to talk in the old days of fear around nuclear war, there used to be a clock, and they always used to say so many minutes before midnight. I would say we are probably beyond 5 minutes before midnight, certainly for those of us living in the developing world. So when we look then at how most of us campaign in the environmental movement, we go after companies that are destroying forests, destroying oceans, expanding fossil fuels in risky places like the Arctic and so on. But the problem is there are far too many bad companies that are doing bad things, and we do not anymore have the time to go and campaign against every single company to knock them down, to actually get them to change. But interestingly, all the companies in the world, with a few exceptions, when they want to expand their activity, and quite often, let's be very clear, expansion of the activity means engaging in environmental crimes. They have to go borrow money from some institution. So today, for the first time, I'm presenting, and this is part of a process of launching a campaign to actually get much smarter at addressing the climate crisis by not simply campaigning against those that do the bad things, but to start campaigning against those that enable financially the companies that do the bad thing. So the first area, I'm happy to say, is up and running. This is called Divest from Fossil Fuels, Invest in Renewable Energy. And I hope that Occidental College will very soon join a few other universities in the world to make sure that none of their investments are in fossil fuels. But this campaign is aimed at universities, pension funds, religious institutions, high net worth wealthy individuals, and foundations and trusts. And in 2 years of this campaign, launched by 350 and a range of other organizations, I'm happy to report that about $3.5 trillion has now been earmarked for divestment from fossil fuels. Right? That's quite impressive. However, what needs to happen here is that we need to ensure that the skills to wage this campaign in every country, in every university, in every trade union which has access to the pension funds and so on, that the skills are there for people, whether they live in Africa or Asia or the US, they should be empowered to be able to actually do this in a way that actually shifts money from fossil fuels. Now, I should tell you that shifting money out of fossil fuels is hard enough, but then making sure that that money goes not to military expenditure or some other bad investment, to get money to flow to renewable energy is still a big task for us. And there's work to be done to develop a menu of investment options which makes investment in big and small renewable energy projects a easy and attractive thing for people that and institutions that are shifting the money out of fossil fuel investments into renewable energies. So this area, I'm happy to say, is up and running, but what we need to do is expand it, deepen it, broaden it, and make sure in every country around the world, people are mobilized to actually go after those institutions to divest from fossil fuels and invest in renewable energy. The third area, again, positively, which is happening, Greenpeace, Rainforest Action Network, and many other organizations are actually getting smarter, that when you campaign against what you could call carbon bomb projects, such as the coal mine in Queensland, Australia at the moment, that rather than campaign just against the coal company, you follow the money and you go campaign against the banks. I was there in July last year, and I was so happy to see how well a broad alliance of organizations were working together to ensure that money was, that the banks would actually say, we will not fund this project. And right now, all the banks in Australia, all the banks internationally have said they will not fund what would be the largest coal mine in Australia's history and one of the largest coal mines in world history. So what is needed here is we need to create tools that actually ensures that anybody, whether it's, as is happening at the moment, an indigenous community in Amazon was fighting against a dam, how can we support that community, have the knowledge, the skills, and so on, to go after not just the company that's building the dams, but the people that are seeking to fund it. Then, but the problem with putting all our eggs in the basket of going after carbon bomb projects' financial components is that there are too many carbon bomb projects happening at the moment, and there are too many in the pipeline. Therefore, we need to now explore, in a context where banks are at its lowest levels of legitimacy in the world, a generic campaign that goes after all banks and lending institutions saying, thou should not lend to that which destroys the future, and you should not be lending to oil, coal, and gas, the key fossil fuels. You should be lending in a different direction. This is something that we need to start, and many of us are now plotting to try to actually get that going, to put pressure on the lending institutions. The problem, though, with putting all your eggs in this basket is that there's far too many lending institutions. It's not just the high street banks like Bank of America or Citibank, but it's state-owned banks, it's investment banks, it's intergovernmental banks, it's hedge funds, and a range of obscure lending instruments. That is why we need another level of intervention, and this is challenging regulatory and central banks to adopt strong sustainability criteria that sends a message to all lending institutions that they need to shift from fossil fuel investing to clean energy investments. Now, this might sound like pie in the sky, because what it means in the US is that we need to put pressure on the Federal Reserve to step up and do the right thing. But there is a process underway where United Nations Environment Program has done a study where, in fact, there's a recommendation on the table of how we might actually make these changes. So all of these areas, there are good people working in it, but we're still far too few, and we need to now make this a major part of our effort moving forward. Just excuse me for a sec, please. I'm just feeling the burn. I couldn't resist giving the man a plug. So, in conclusion, let me say this, that nature does not negotiate. We cannot change the science, we can only change political will. And the problem we have is that far too many of our political leaders have been bought lock, stock, and barrel by the fossil fuel industry. President Bush, it's no secret that the fossil fuel industry bought that election for him lock, stock, and barrel. And in the United States, I would say, can be today described as the best democracy money can buy. And when you go and unpack which money buys that influence, it's disproportionately fossil fuels, nuclear, military, and pharmaceuticals and other polluting industries. I want to end on a positive note. We in the environmental movement often say, save the environment, save the planet. Good news is, the planet does not need saving. Because if we continue on the path that we are, we'll warm up the planet to a point that humanity will not be able to exist here. We'll be gone, the planet actually will still be here. And once we get out of the way, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So let's be very clear. This struggle is fundamentally about protecting our children and their children's futures. And there can be nothing more important than us putting all our energies in that direction. And if our political leaders have any modicum of decency, they should put our children and their children's interests first and engage in a massive energy revolution from an economy that's driven by dirty brown fossil fuel-based energy to an economy that's driven by clean, green, renewable energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kumi.